Hello everyone, it's History Behind the Warrior, and as always, welcome back to yet another video. Now, kind of coming off my more recent videos regarding Injustice Gods Among Us, where I did of course touch on the missing characters of the first installment. Today, I wanted to take a similar mindset, formula and approach to talk about what may have become of the characters from the cast of Injustice 2, analysing, breaking down and really getting into the meat of those characters, as to what possibly became of them and whether or not they will return in a future installment. Because, let's face it, despite the large, diverse and pretty solid cast of characters, not everyone here is going to return for the next installment. I mean, hell, only half the cast actually returned from Injustice 1, so you can definitely presume that the same attitude and mindset will be applied here for a possible third installment. Plus, despite the comic book run of Injustice 2 having ended long after the game's release, and them even publishing a prequel series a few years later, we still don't really have a canonical answer as to what happened after the events of the base game, having never really been truly transparent about what direction they'll be going in. However, it is worth saying that one of those endings have actually been explored in a non-canonical manner, that being Injustice vs. the Masters of the Universe, having the somewhat aftermath of this game be concluded in an isolated comic book run. And whilst this could be utilised as a sequel, NetherRealm isn't really known for adapting established material one-to-one, with Mortal Kombat 9 being a perfect example of that. And hell, even the Arkham Asylum sequence of Injustice 2, which is designed to be a very soft retelling of the events of Year 1. So as of right now, the window of who can and can't return is incredibly open, but seeing as one ending hasn't been explored, we will be using that as our jump off point for this video, that of course being the Batman ending. So with that said and everything else in mind, just a quick reminder before we do get a start on this, that currently as of making this video, an Injustice 3 is yet to be officially announced by NetherRealm Studios, so everything is most certainly up in the air. But we do have some unofficial word that something of the sorts DC related is most certainly cooking, with Injustice 3 being the most likely choice. Now going into this, I do actually have some rules to cut the fat and to get to the point of each individual character. So we will be tackling what happened to them at the end of the game, what is their possible fates, what could their arcade ladder hint towards, and then use our overall knowledge of the universe to ultimately understand what could become of them going into the next game, whether or not they could or they won't return. And also, for obvious reasons, I won't be featuring any guest characters here, as they're not strictly tied to the DC universe, despite how much I would like some of their inclusions. And I will of course also be taking into account some outside factors that could ultimately impact particular individuals here, especially with the most recent DC reboot rebrand under James Gunn. But just before we do begin, just a quick reminder that if you like what we do here and wish to see more, please don't forget to subscribe as well as give this video a like, and try out the new weird hype mechanic down in the comments section below. Because for those of you unaware, YouTubers all across the board have been kind of fucked in the algorithm recently. So right now YouTube channels across the board are really taking a pretty heavy hit, including that of my own. So if you could please do that, as well as leave a comment down below, it'd greatly help out the channel and I'd super appreciate it. Anyway, without any further ado, let's get right into things, starting from the top left side of the roster and working our way across. So to begin, let's start with Swamp Thing. Now, the Guardian of the Green made his last and final appearance during the world's finest chapter, having played an antagonistic role in Brainiac's ship, as he had been brainwashed by the cyborg's influence, battling the likes of Batman and Superman in a failed attempt to stop the duo. But with the defeat of Brainiac, it is believed that he was released of his control. As for what became of him following that point, we don't exactly know, but understanding the nature of Swamp Thing and how he serves the Green, having no real ties to either the insurgency nor regime, it's pretty safe to assume that he simply would have returned back to Earth and continued to serve as its guardian, not interested in the squabbles between the regime and the insurgency, likely awaiting the arrival of the next crisis event. So does this necessarily mean he'll return in the next game? Well, I don't think it's particularly likely, as it's incredibly dependent on what occurs in the sequel. Realistically, it isn't outside the realm of possibility, but as a one and done outing goes, especially with how little he was involved in the overall story, I definitely wouldn't expect Swamp Thing to return in the future. Cyborg, an extremely loyal member of the regime, Vic's ties to them are pretty understandable, considering just how many of the Titans died during the destruction of Metropolis. But where does it place him in the world of Injustice 3? Well, at the end of the game's story, following Brainiac's defeat, Vic is notably pretty absent during the game's final events. In fact, his last appearance is just prior to the League's attack on Brainiac's ship. Thus, he does leave the narrative pretty early on. So by not being present during the disintegration of the League, it's very possible that Vic got away unlike many of his compatriots, with his whereabouts more or less being completely unknown, as his arcade ladder ending doesn't really hint at where he could be. Because of the open-ended nature of this, it really does keep the window of opportunity very open for him to return in the next installment, especially if more Teen Titan characters are to return. Catwoman, whilst also absent in the final chapter of the game. If we're following the Batman story ending, it should pretty much go without saying here that the Bat and the Cat are kind of tied to each other at this point in time, being a key part of his family and support system. She's kind of integral to him here in this universe. So with Bruce's victory over Clark and Brainiac, the restoration of peace and ushering a new age of the Justice League could very well mean the end days of Selina Kyle's cat burgling career, as I would imagine that the UN would probably frown on the new Justice League's leader being someone that does regularly commit crimes. So I see them going in either one of two directions here. That Selina herself joins the League and does abandon her cat burgling ways, probably struggling to adjust to the lifestyle, as old habits do die hard, and it wouldn't surprise me if they did split up because of that. Or the other option, where she does settle down and retire, and possibly even gets married to Bruce, as this was also a storyline which was tackled a few years ago. So whilst not outside the realm of possibility, I'd say it's a 50-50 situation for Selina. Because if she stays with the League, she's more than likely gonna wind up being playable in the next game. And if she doesn't, or splits with Bruce, then this may be her way of kind of exiting herself out the series. Both kind of work in their own ways. The Flash. Now Barry is actually present during the final confrontation between Bruce and Superman, having sided with the Caped Crusader to stop his former allies, and taking on the Man of Steel in a failed attempt to halt the Kryptonian. Unfortunately, following these events, it's pretty hard to decipher what became of Barry here, as prior to this point, the Flash was effectively under house arrest and being monitored by Bruce. But I do feel like the events of the game more than likely put him back into the good books of Bruce Wayne. But whether or not he chooses to continue remaining the Flash, that's kind of hard to say, because you gotta keep in mind that since Injustice 2's release, we have also had the return of Wally West in the main continuity, a very notable Flash and Speedster that was absent following the events of the New 52, meaning that it's very possible for this mantle to be passed on to someone else, as he is also a beloved character, and the first Flash to many of us who were introduced to the Justice League through the Unlimited TV series. So by all means a worthy successor, but currently Wally is yet to be introduced in any capacity. But it does make sense in a lot of ways, as he wasn't canonically present during Metropolis's explosion. So right now, of all of the options and choices here, I would say that Barry more than likely would become a part of Bruce's new Justice League, becoming a mentor to a newer generation, which is pretty heavily foreshadowed throughout multiple different arcade ladder endings in the game. Hence why I also brought up Wally, as he could also wind up being one of these individuals. Green Lantern, yet another member of Batman's insurgency who stood against Superman. Hal really does get the short end of the stick here, because whilst many members of the regime are able to walk away pretty unscathed, Hal gets punched in the face, his constructs are completely shattered, he is sent plummeting to the earth with Superman, and then has his hand completely turned into mashed potato by Clark, making it a pretty rough last and final appearance for Hal. So what ultimately becomes of him following this point? Well, if we're theorizing, there are two paths I can actually see him going down. One is that he does of course remain on Earth, joins the new league and does teach the next generation, maybe even mentoring a successor, like Jessica Cruz, Joe or Simon. Or that he returns back to Oa in service of the Guardians, who, mind you, more than likely wish to keep a really close eye on him, probably being notified about the temptation of rage he felt when he was confronted by Atrocitus, and still feeling its effects during the last chapter of the game. But again, whilst he is on Oa, he could still of course fill in that mentor-like role again, only returning back to Earth for whatever shenanigans occur in the next installment. Either way, he's hinted alongside Barry, so I think his return is more or less guaranteed at this point. Whether it's him under the mantle, that's hard to say, but of all the Green Lanterns, he is the most popular, and also one that he did not murder. Harley Quinn. Now Harley's a pretty interesting situation, because unlike a fair few members of the League, who does make it to the game's finale, she gets a bit of an abrupt ending to her story during Wonder Woman's chapter, having a spat with the princess, which ultimately ends with a sword being driven through her chest. It's only by Supergirl's intervention where she is saved, and the wound is cauterized where she's then carried off, presumably to have her wounds tended to. Now, does this definitively mark an end to Harley Quinn in the Injustice universe? And I will say, no, not even close. Because in a series that isn't really afraid to murder its characters and cast, the way I see it is no body, no kill. And besides, Harley's popularity alone would most certainly keep her above water here. As for what she's gotten up to since these events, well, I do think she would have a place amongst Bruce's new Justice League, or at least having been a secretive member of it, having been reformed since the Joker's death. But I think arguably the most important thing she does is act as a strong guardian and figure to her daughter, Lucy. And whilst like I said she does disappear quite early on, I have absolutely no doubt she's alive and well, most certainly appearing in the sequel here. Batman. Now yet another character that is a given to return. The Dark Knight of the Trinity would be the only one of the trio not strictly confined to that of chains, looking to lead a new Justice League in the fall of the regime, with the last time that we do see the character being when Clark is sealed away to that of the Phantom Zone, agreeing with Kara to usher in this new age. And honestly, it's kind of impossible to say what else really happens with him at this point, with this ending being incredibly definitive and conclusive. The only real separate indication we do have here is that possibly following this point, he may go into retirement, but only for the sake of preparing for Clark's inevitable return. Beyond this though, what becomes of him is pretty cut and dry here. Red Hood. Now this one is particularly strange. Having released in the post-launch of the game as DLC, Red Hood narratively has absolutely zero ties to the overarching story. In fact, his only canonical appearance here would be during the Injustice 2 comic book line, having been dressed as Batman himself, working alongside the Al Ghul in order to usher in a new world order. But even when that's said and done, he does exit out the series in the middle of the run. And honestly, the only real substance we do have here is from his arcade ladder ending, where it hints that he refuses to join neither the regime or insurgency, instead continuing to ride solo and achieve justice by his own means, which in many ways could be seen as a symbolic outing of the character. Whilst I 100% think it's possible for him to return on the base roster, with how he's been written and tackled, Jason doesn't really have any actual stakes in this fight, and so it wouldn't really make sense for him to appear here, unless Bruce was to reach out to him. Red Hood's inclusion in Injustice 2 was to definitely capitalize off the popularity and hype of him during the mid-2010s, something that has since died down quite a fair bit. Superman. Yet another character that's kind of a given at this point. Superman's current predicament is both a definitive and very intriguing one, having been defeated by Bruce and incarcerated to the Phantom Zone, but not before letting him know that he would inevitably come back, something that Bruce does take into account. Whilst he may be depowered going into the Phantom Zone, I have no doubt that in some way, shape and form he will be able to restore his powers. And here's the thing, with it being the Phantom Zone, there are a plethora of different villains he can meet, recruit and interact with. Because, let's face it, we know that he's perfectly fine with recruiting criminals. Plus, I do actually think he has quite a bit of an ace in the hole here, because even if his powers don't return, as time doesn't actually pass in the Phantom Zone, he still has Doomsday, who we do know does exist in the Phantom Zone, and along with that, he's completely submissive to Kal-El's control, so it's a very real possibility that Doomsday could still wind up following his orders, having him do his dirty work and be his muscle in the Phantom Zone, with a join me or die attitude. So let's face it was never really a matter of if Superman will escape, it's ultimately when. Joker. Now this one's pretty to the point, as the death of the Joker is the inciting incident to everything unraveling in this reality. And with there having been 6 to 7 years since his demise, this does mark an end to the character, right? Well, as much as I do think it does make sense narratively, this is also the Joker, a character that is unbelievably synonymous with pop culture. So whilst I do think he's dead, yes, I am almost certain that they will find a way to somehow weasel this character into the story, just like they did in Injustice 2. Now mind you, since that game, things with the Joker have calmed down quite a bit, as his inclusion in Injustice 2 kind of came at a time where everyone was hyper exposed to the character, as well as whatever the fuck that is. But despite the narrative issues and constraints surrounding him, I am almost certain they will find a way to include him here. Whether that be through a Blackest Night approach, or Three Jokers inspired retcon storyline. When there's a will, there is a way. And if there's anyone that can wind up cheating death, it is most certainly the Clown Prince of Crime, Atrocitus. Whilst an absolutely stellar and wonderful inclusion for a Lantern adversary, in the grander scale of the overall narrative, Atrocitus was kind of a letdown, having played an otherwise very forgettable role in the game, having only appeared and been featured once, where he essentially rage baits Hal Jordan into wanting to become a Red Lantern. Outside of this, we do not see him again, having presumably returned back to Yasmalt in order to stew in all of his fiery rage and misery. So very little is kind of known of what becomes of Atrocitus following this point, and really, I just don't see him returning. I presume that each installment will serve as a way to introduce a new Lantern Corps to the universe, kind of like what they did with Sinestro in the first game. It's an ever-revolving door. Gorilla Grodd, a general of Brainiac's siege. During the game itself, Grodd was a very formidable adversary, utilizing his members of the Society as pawns to further his own agendas and plans. And despite his ties to Brainiac, his ambition is what made him so deadly, and also what made him so blind to the truth, with his overconfidence pitting him against the likes of Black Adam and Aquaman, leading to his own downfall and death by the hands of Arthur Curry. Thus, Grodd's time in the universe is best described as short but sweet. And whilst I wouldn't rule out a return, because well, comic books. Considering how this series likes to maintain its status quo with character deaths, I probably wouldn't expect to see Grodd return anytime soon. Cheetah, a member of Grodd's society, Cheetah was a very fierce hunter amongst the pack, but admittedly was one that did play an incredibly minor role in the overarching narrative, having at one point clashed with Green Lantern, as well as having played a hand in Brainiac's siege, using this time and opportunity to fight and confront Wonder Woman, with her at first actually gaining the upper hand with a ginormous cannon, and even incapacitating Supergirl. Things were looking up for her, until she was attacked and overwhelmed, almost nearly being killed until Harley Quinn does intervene. Now the details following this point are quite bare for the members of the Society, but it is revealed in an intro that following the death of Grodd, the Society would disband, having learned that Brainiac would much prefer to possess the world than allow them to conquer it. So what happens following this point is kind of anyone's guess, but knowing her true nature, it wouldn't at all surprise me if she disappeared to the warmest rainforest possible and began a new hunt to satiate her bloodlust. I don't really see her returning anytime soon, as much like Atrocitus, it does feel like she's in the ever-rotating door of Wonder Woman villains. So I wouldn't hold my breath for her return. Deadshot, filling in the gun quota character of the roster and tie into the Suicide Squad movie. Floyd Lawton was basically enslaved to Grodd and the Society, with his thumb on the trigger at any point in time to blow his head off, with Grodd himself actually referring to him as a dog, making it pretty damn evident and clear that the only reason he continues to do this is out of the hopes of being reunited with his daughter. So, as mentioned beforehand, when the society falls, it's kind of impossible to know what becomes of him. But I do feel like his arcade ladder ending serves as a bit of an answer and actual definitive end for the character, having the bomb removed from his brain by Wayne Industries, and then being reunited with his daughter, effectively reformed from his criminal ways. But then again, there is just the horrible possibility that this would be done before he's then returned back to Belle Reve. But I much prefer the good ending here, feeling more conclusive for Deadshot's character and the way to write him out. Plus, let's face it, with Deadshot having basically replaced Deathstroke in this game for the whole mercenary gun villain character, I'm almost certain that he won't return, so a character like Bloodsport or Peacemaker could feature in the next installments. It just makes the most sense to me here. Poison Ivy, yet another servant of the Green. Pamela is in a really weird, interesting position in Injustice 2, because in many ways her character does feel really off and kind of inconsistent with her comic book counterpart, where she's more of a complex loving character, only ever siding with Ra's al Ghul for the betterment of the planet. But here, she's far more vindictive and kind of nihilistic. It does feel like she only joins the society out of the hopes of bringing an end to the world of man. I mean, a perfect example of this is actually her relationship with Harley here, because these two are kind of synonymous with each other romantically, and do actually get married at one point in the comics. Yet here, following their separation, Pamela does send her into cardiac shock, nearly killing her. Now mind you, the relationship is established in the Year Zero comic books, which would come out long after the release of Injustice 2. But there really does seem to be a disconnect between these two mediums, as the characters feel so different from each other. I mean, hell, even the Injustice 2 comic book version is no way near as cruel as this. So in the aftermath of Injustice 2, and the disintegration of the society, what would really be the fate of Poison Ivy at this point? Well, I do feel like she would probably return back to Gotham. That makes a lot of sense for her character. Would that be alongside Harley? Probably. Because let's face it, Harley's Harley. She's the crazy girl. So something like that is indeed like super possible. As for whether or not she would return, I really don't see that happening, as she more than likely sits in the very same camp that Swamp Thing does, but with the added benefit that she's a villain, which would make sense why she may not want to be involved. Starfire. Moving along to another DLC character here, Corey's appearance in the Injustice universe can be at best described as few and far between, having only briefly appeared during the annual series, where she's imprisoned to the Phantom Zone, and later having played an incredibly minor role during the Injustice 2 comic book series. So with that in mind and her absence very much so felt, where could Corey currently be in the universe? And could we see her return? Well, I think the possibility of her coming back is incredibly high, as one of the beloved elements of the Injustice roster are the Teen Titan characters. Whether that's Robin, Cyborg, Raven, or Starfire, they are all very well regarded amongst the fandom. But in a universe this broken, bleak, and twisted, where majority of her friends are gone, it would make sense why something like this could be brought into question. And that's where I think her arcade ladder ending does come into play here, with it looking like she's going to mentor the next generation of heroes, as it honors the memory of the Titans, the only real family she had or truly liked. The Atom, yet another DLC inclusion we do have here, and the Atom is in a unique place in this universe. Whilst again, largely absent from the story, the Atom did play quite a minor role in the Injustice 2 comics, only being utilized to restrain Superman, and then played a hand in fighting Amazo. But like, here's the thing, right? That wasn't the same Atom. That Atom was Ray Palmer, and the one we have in game is Ryan Choi. So they're two separate entities. And here's the thing, unlike some of the other DLC characters here, Ryan feels really disconnected from the overall narrative as a whole, mostly focused on finding his mentor, completely unaware of his fate. So his canvas is already painted, but could also wind up being something that's completely not canon because of it, making it kind of possible for him to be a part of the new generation of Titans or League members. Yet considering just how out of the loop he is with everything else, I wouldn't say his chances are particularly too high here. Enchantress. Well, it looks like we aren't done with the DLC characters just yet, and this one could not be any more disconnected from the rest of the narrative, with the Enchantress herself yet to appear canonically in any source of medium, having not appeared in the comics, the story, or even an arcade ladder ending, so there's no canonical substance here, feeling definitely more of a tie-in to the Suicide Squad movie. Although the window of opportunity to appear is most certainly open, she's honestly the weakest pick on this list here, so I don't see the chances of her making an appearance moving forward being very high. Black Manta, our last and final DC DLC inclusion here. Manta's appearance in the series has been pretty bare and minimal to say the least, with his appearances being limited to the Injustice Zero comic book line, and part of a stage transition. So canonically, we don't really know what he gets up to or does during the events of Injustice 2. And character-wise, he's only ever really been tied to Aquaman, who, mind you, doesn't really have a nemesis on the base roster. So I don't think that reflects entirely well on Black Manta here, as this may wind up being something that sticks, or as a way to kind of feed him out the back door. We will have to wait and see, but I don't think Manta's chances are very high right now. Supergirl. Now this one's kind of a given to return, having been a really important figure during the events of Injustice 2, agreeing to assist Bruce in forming a new Justice League following the exile of Kal-El, which of course brings on the question of, what else could have happened following this point in time? Well, that's really tricky, because outside of forming the Justice League, her position is kinda conclusive, but there are some hints and theories that could indicate what comes next for the character, with her arcade ladder ending teasing at the possible restoration of Krypton, which, whilst nice, is something I don't think will happen here, because if there's one constant in the DC universe, is that Krypton is kind of a dead world, and if such a thing was to occur, I really doubt it would stick after that point. And along with this, we don't really know if she's able to restore the symbol of hope on her chest. Kal-El did a pretty solid job of turning that into a symbol of fear. And the reason I'm actually mentioning this is because of her Earth 2 counterpart, Power Girl. Because I do expect a bit of a time gap between the events of Injustice 2 to 3, and they've always kind of struggled to have or find a really good reason for why that Kara doesn't utilize the crest. I feel like here it's way more appropriate and could be written in quite well. Either way though, I have like absolutely no doubt that we will most certainly see Kara in the following installment. Green Arrow and Black Canary. By normal means, I would have kept these two separate, but in this universe, the duo are practically tied to each other by the hip, even as villains, as by the end of the game where the two are brainwashed, they are side by side with each other, battling the likes of Aquaman and Black Adam, failing in their assaults and release of the cyborg's control. So what becomes of them now? Well, in my mind, it could go in two directions, as Black Canary's arcade ladder ending does hint at a few ideas here. You see, following Brainiac's siege, it is revealed that their son Connor has activated his metagene, and the two do look to use their ties to the League to learn more about their son's powers. Whether or not this results in them retiring from the League though, is a really important question, because it would make sense why they may want to take some time away to focus on that family dynamic. But considering how much both of them have gone through, it wouldn't surprise me at all if they weren't present in the next game, with this serving as a perfect way out. Dr. Fate. Now this one's pretty easy and to the point here, as well, he's dead, with Kent Nelson having died in the game's finale, having been murdered by Brainiac and merged with his ship. Now, in most cases and scenarios, this wouldn't be a problem, with the universe itself having had multiple Dr. Fates and individuals that have donned the helmet. But I feel like this one is absolutely more definitive. After the helmet of Nabu is effectively corrupted, with it perceiving Brainiac as a way to restore order, Kal-El would take the helmet of Nabu and crumble it in his very hands. marking both an end for the mask and the title. Blue Beetle and Firestorm, whilst both played a villainous role in the game's finale, having been brainwashed and put under the influence of Brainiac. In the fall of the events of the game, Blue Beetle and Firestorm are effectively seen as the League's newest initiates, and seen in Bruce's eyes as the next generation of heroes. So with Brainiac's defeat and them essentially freed of his control, what does this mean for the two moving forward? Well, I believe there's actually a multitude of different paths here, with one of them probably not returning. Now the first here is Jaime, who does seem to be quite enthusiastic about Bruce's wishes and becoming a full-fledged member of the League, which I do feel is super likely here. His arcade ladder ending, on the other hand, does say otherwise, hinting that Jaime may also prefer to just return back home to his family life and finish school, but still maintain that olive branch if needed. As for Firestorm though, his ending kinda feels a little bit more definitive, with his arcade ladder ending teasing that following the events of this game, that the two may decide to separate, as they are completely out of control during the arcade ladder ending. Somewhat mirroring when Firestorm nearly nuked an entire city in order to keep Superman in captivity. So of the two new generation League heroes, I definitely do feel like if one was to disappear, it would be Firestorm, because Jaime himself isn't so dependent to join with someone, and still does retain the Scarab by the end of the story. Aquaman. Now the last time we do see the King of the Seven Seas, it is during the final chapter of the game, having sided with the regime in order to restore Atlantis, which at the time had been captured by Brainiac. So the League unraveling once more, and Bruce not wishing to break his no-kill rule, Alpha's hand is forced to turn on his insurgency allies, with his duties as a king taking priority here, leading to Bruce unfortunately being forced to incapacitate Arthur, driving his own trident through his leg, leaving him alive but most certainly wounded. As for what follows for Arthur and Atlantis, it's hard to say, with even his arcade ladder ending not indicating what becomes next for him, for what really is a king without his kingdom. If I was to theorize, I feel like following the events of Batman's victory, he would slowly learn how to unravel these worlds, with Bruce himself holding off Atlantis to last, to punish Arthur for his betrayal, more than likely sending the king down a deep spiraling depression. But with the world of Atlantis restored, honestly, I could really see him and his kingdom retreating from the eyes of man, somewhat sick of being caught in their petty squabbles and affairs. So moving forward, I don't really see Aquaman returning, unless it's a direct threat towards him and his people, maybe even pushing someone like Mira to become Atlantis' new representative with the outside world. Darkseid, having served as a pre-order bonus character for this game, of any of the characters here that could come back as the big bad, Darkseid is kind of like the go-to pick here. And he has more than enough of a reason to do so. And with the lost son of Krypton having been exiled to the Phantom Zone, the world of man has never been more vulnerable or ripe for the picking right now, with a new Justice League just about being formed. But realistically, outside of this, there are just so many other options, with villains that did not feature in this game, such as Necron, the Anti-Monitor, the Batman Who Laughs. There's a lot of choices outside of this pick here. But I think if we are to pick and choose from the options we have, Darkseid is a perfect pick here, as it's not a matter of if, but when he will wind up attacking Earth. Plus, I do feel like a contributing factor here could actually be the most recent success of the Absolute comic book line, with the foundation of that universe having been built upon Darkseid's vision and creation. And with its positive reception and success over the last year, it wouldn't at all surprise me if this played a part in making Darkseid the main antagonist, as he is just so popular right now. Wonder Woman. Now this one is a particularly hard one to get a grasp of accurately. Whilst she does appear in the final chapter of the game, and does of course side with Clark to defeat Bruce, she's defeated by the Dark Knight, yet is completely absent in the fall of the game, not being present during Kal-El's exile, or even really touched upon in arcade ladder endings. So what could have become of Diana here? Well, I think that there's two possibilities. The first, that she more than likely escaped to Kahndaq, as it was where she stayed during the Injustice 2 comic book line. Or the second option here, that she was indeed captured following Superman's defeat, Where she winds up though following this point is where things get a bit interesting, because I don't know if she would be returned to Themyscira, because she was originally incarcerated there following the events of the first game, which did of course lead to her escape, and I highly doubt she would be dropped off in the Phantom Zone, as reuniting her with Clark would be extremely foolish. So in my mind, there are actually a few options here. The first, that she is kept and punished in a private prison, much like the one that Bruce had for Clark, where he's able to keep a close eye on the Amazon. Or another option, where she's banished to the heavens of Olympus, bound to the godly plane, and banned from intervening from the world of man. Which makes sense, considering her ties to Zeus, and how the gods now refuse to interfere with the world of man, from year 4 of the comic books onwards. But there's also the very real possibility that she may be banished to Bana Migdal, a separate tribe of the Amazons located in the sands of Egypt, with they themselves being exiled Amazons. There's a lot of options that can actually be played about with the fate of Wonder Woman, and whilst the mantle could indeed be passed on to someone like Donna Troy, Diana's kind of the Wonder Woman. She's incredibly important to the narrative at this point, so there's no way we're not seeing her return under a different mantle. It's ultimately just kind of interesting. What would shackle her at this point following the game? Black Adam, another member of Superman's regime that stayed by his side. Adam makes his last and final appearance having battled Bruce, with the Dark Knight defeating the God-made man. So what became of him? Well, from the information we do have two paths that kind of mirror elements of Wonder Woman's possible fate. Either having been defeated and captured, then being brought before the UN for his crimes, or two, that he was able to return back and escape to Kahndaq. Whilst not canon, it is implied through his arcade ladder ending that during the siege of Kahndaq, Brainiac's attack did far more damage than he had known, leaving it in tatters with his queen having died. And whilst the ending does allude to Ra's al Ghul, who might I also add is dead so I'd void out that part of the ending, it wouldn't surprise me if Adam remained in Kahndaq in order to rebuild what was left of his kingdom. So do I think the chances of Black Adam returning being particularly high? Probably not. Because I'd imagine a huge contributing factor to his inclusion was the continuous delayed release of the Black Adam movie. Captain Cold, another member of Grodd Society here. Cold was a loyal member of his vision, with it allowing him to act out on his violence against the regime, with them having been responsible for the death of his sister, Golden Glider. But shortly following the reveal of Brainiac's true intentions, he would understandably defect from their side, making his current whereabouts unknown following his loss to Wonder Woman. But if I was a betting man, and if we do line things up with his arcade ladder ending, it looks like Snot was able to bury the hatchet with the Speedster, kind of giving him closure following the events of everything. Does this necessarily mean the return of the Rogues, or to that of a life of crime? That's anyone's guess. But it does feel like that closure could effectively conclude Captain Cold's story right there. Plus, realistically, again, if we're drawing lines of similarity to that of the prior roster, Cold kind of fills in the Cryomancer spot here, having effectively replaced Killer Frost. So I imagine from this point onwards, that slot on the roster is more than likely interchangeable. Robin. Now, Damian's appearance in the later half of Injustice 2 is incredibly brief to say the least, having been released by Supergirl and then later defeated by her in the Fortress of Solitude. In fact, of all of the characters in the Insurgency, he opts out of the narrative really early on, so it brings up the point of what could have become of Damian here. Well, with the defeat of Kal-El, I think that the smart thing for Damian to do is to actually go back into hiding, with it not at all honestly surprising me if he was to return back to the League of Shadows, considering how he's been handled across 2 games here, where he's Nightwing in the first installment, and then Robin in the second. It wouldn't surprise me if that by the 3rd game, as let's face it, he's far too important to Bruce as a character to not be here. He'd more than likely inherit his birthright and become the next Ra's al Ghul, with this position being open since the Injustice 2 comic books. And something like this is kinda softly alluded to in his arcade ladder ending, where Bruce is killed and then he takes over the mantle of Batman. So you can probably expect a similar mindset and approach be given to this character moving forward, as it does just make so much sense here. And people do want Ra's as a playable character in game. Scarecrow and Bane. Our last final two remaining members of the society here. This duo would follow their compatriots in leaving the group, following the reveal of Brainiac's intentions. Now, as for their fates, that's kind of an interesting one, as neither of their arcade ladder endings really tease as to what comes next for them. So if I was to theorize, is that following Crane's defeat to the hands of Wonder Woman, I would fully expect the Madman to return back to Gotham, and cooking up his next batch of fear toxin to rival what the Joker had made. As for Bane, I would fully expect him to return back to the underworld, awaiting his next opportunity to confront and challenge the Bat. So he more than likely binds his time for the next encounter. Although I don't see Crane returning, I do think that Bane sits more in the realm of possibility, being so incredibly iconic to the Bat. And I think what helps be such a strong contributing factor here is that Bane is the only big body grappler that has stayed around. So unless another Batman character of a similar size and archetype does appear, I do see Bane returning. Onto our last character here, Brainiac is a weird one to tackle, because in Absolute Power's ending, Brainiac canonically dies. But in Absolute Justice, he does survive. So what becomes of the cyborg here? It's really hard to have an answer, as due to his vast intellect, this isn't really an individual you can outsmart. And in my mind, the best thing Bruce can do is effectively neutralize him by stripping him of his cybernetic augmentations, to not make him as much of a threat as he is now. But if we are to draw some influence here, it wouldn't surprise me if Salvation was brought in some capacity. Now bringing us on to the question of, could we see him return? And the answer really feels like possibly. Whilst I definitely don't see this Brainiac returning, his arcade ladder ending does tease at the possibility of a future ancestor coming back, which is very well possible, but I only feel like something like this would happen or really be dictated by the main overall story and narrative. So it's all very much so dependent on that. Without that being a factor, I really don't know if I see Brainiac returning in the future. So, with that said and everything covered here, that has been it for this extremely long-winded video, touching on each and every DC character of the Injustice 2 roster. Where could they be following the events of the base game, and the likelihood behind their return and or absence. So I do hope you have enjoyed this video and most certainly learnt more by doing so, because from what you can tell, I had a lot to say on this topic, especially with the fates of particular characters I do expect to see and I don't expect to see in the future. So with that said and everything covered here, I now relay the question to all of you of, what characters do you want to see for the next installment? What do you expect to become of some of the figures you see here? Please do comment down below, as I'd love to hear what you have to say. But until the next one everyone, that has been it for me. Take care, and I'll catch you in the next one.